So it's always good to start your presentation with those immortal words, "Can you hear me?" I'm actually talking to you from sunny Somerset today, where the temperatures are now in the sort of high 20s and still climbing. So I think we're heading towards 30 today, which does remind me of the weather conditions actually when we undertook this survey, where it was very hot in the late part of the summer, which probably did have some bearing on the results at the end of the day. Yeah, so just going back to the topic again, what I'm going to talk to you about is a fairly detailed invertebrate survey that we conducted back in 2018. So it was a little while ago, but I suspect it's probably one of the more in-depth surveys that have been completed, certainly recently in the Burren. And the picture of the cover of the report is on the right-hand side of the presentation there. It is in fact available online. So if you wish to, you want to see it, if you Google Irish Wildlife Manuals 127 and NPWS, you should be able to find it. There's about 100 odd pages of detail about what we found, and you'll see a bit more than I'm able to sort of talk to you about during the time I've got available today. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to cover is a brief introduction to the two sites that we looked at. So one, as Brian's already alluded, was Slieve Carron, the other was Ballyogan Lochs. I'm going to talk a little bit about moths, but that'll be very brief because I think Dave's probably covered quite a bit of that already. I will talk about some of the interesting finds in some of the other groups. I won't elaborate now, but I'll talk about Pantheon outputs. A lot of people probably won't know what that means, but I'll explain that a bit later. And finally, I'll talk about habitat management and what the future might hold in some ways for the Burren. Yeah, next slide, please. So moving swiftly on, Slieve Carron is largely a limestone pavement site. There are some damp habitats in there, but they're pretty limited. So it's confined to really fairly small seepages and wet areas around the margins of this limestone scarp. You can see in the difference there. And the site is situated probably slightly to the north of the middle of the Burren. Next slide, please. This is just an aerial view of the same thing. So the yellow line is the boundary of the site. This block in the middle here is excluded, and that's sort of semi-improved agricultural grassland. But I think this is the boundary of the NPWS owned part of the site. So as you can see from this, there's quite extensive limestone pavement, but mixed up in that are some of the other habitat types which Jesmond talked about earlier, in fact. So we've got a lot of hazel scrub here, some very steep slopes on these ridges. There's lots of spring lines around this area here. Yeah, lots of different types of grassland mixed up in with this limestone pavement. So species-rich grassland, damp patches, and lots of scrub. And again, as other speakers have alluded to, the scrub is quite an important feature of this site. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit more of a detailed couple of pictures. So this is this photo in the circular blob here is a picture of the hazel woodland. I'll talk in a bit more detail about the hazel woodland, but the key thing perhaps to take away from this is that while there is quite a lot of hazel woodland, it's a very close canopy, it's very dark underneath, and almost monotypic. So there's just pretty much one species of tree in there, which is the hazel, with very occasional ash trees poking out above it. There are very few of those really. And again, on the left-hand side here, we've got a fairly typical, rather lovely species-rich grassland, lots of orchids, there's dryas in there, and many of the other kind of wonderful Burren plant species. Next slide. So Ballyogan, much further south, and as you can see from the picture, and sort of in an area that's really very different in character. Next slide. Yeah, okay, so looking at this aerial picture, what we've got here is a fairly large block of cladium fen over in this area, which has been cut over in the past. We've got a road dissecting the site there, a small amount of limestone pavement. We've got lakes, we've got very marly edges to them. This is kind of lush wet grassland. There's little bits of basins filled in with peat and some evidence of acid-loving plants in some of those basins. Lots of scrub, lots of really lovely high hedgerows. The key thing to take away from this, really, I think, is that even though this site is much, much smaller than Slieve Carron, the diversity of habitats on it is much, much higher. So if you stand in the middle of this limestone pavement, you can throw a stone into the cladium fen, you can throw a stone into these rather lovely marly lakes, you can throw a stone into these sort of basin mires that are over here, and into these sort of species-rich grasslands. So a much more diverse site in many ways, and that kind of showed up in the results that we got later on in the project. Next slide. Again, yeah, this is just a photo of the cladium fen with a couple of my colleagues working away in the background there. This is a bank effectively of failed conifer plantation, really not sure what they were thinking. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the really lovely shot of one of the lakes at Ballyogan. And again, you know, just to re-emphasise this, off to the left of the picture, you're on limestone pavement. There's a massive lake there. Just behind you, there's the extensive cladium fens. Really, really lovely place. Next slide. Okay, just talking a little bit about the survey itself. So quite an intensive survey. So we've got a number of pitfall traps out at each site. We had 3 flight intercept traps out, which is a modified version of this thing you can see in the middle picture there. So I've actually got 4 bottles in my flight intercept traps. We put more of those out at Slieve Carron just because there was more woodland. Malaise traps out at both sites, and also we conducted quite a lot of hand searching. So yeah, a lot of capturing insects with sweep nets and butterfly nets, turning stones, generally grubbing about and pond netting. They use quite a wide suite of different techniques that we used. The purpose of the survey really was to pull together site lists, have a look at what was special and, or in some cases, unique to these sites, and also to make some comments on habitat management. We had 3 visits during the course of the year. The first one, I think, was in June. Second visit was in July, and the final one was in August. The weather in July was exceptionally hot. We were kind of in the middle of a drought. So hot, in fact, that the ground shrank and effectively pushed the pitfall traps out of the ground, which wasn't terribly helpful. And all the insects that have been collecting in the preservative liquid in the malaise traps started to rot, and therefore we'd collected absolutely pints and pints of Diptera, and also probably at least 150 carrion beetles in there, which was an absolute delight when it came to emptying those traps. Next slide, please. Okay, so headlines from the survey. We recorded approximately 1,000 species of invertebrates, covering many different groups. So pretty much everything that we got out of the malaise traps, which capture a lot of material, we did get most of that analysed. The people doing the taxonomic work for the report were myself, Roy Anderson, who's hopefully in the audience down there, and also Peter Chandler, who looked at the masses of Diptera we got from these sites. Yeah, so other sort of key headlines from the survey were, again, this is stuff that other people who were talking have alluded to. Many of the species that we recorded were more or less confined to Burren, the Burren in South Galway, the limestone grasslands in South Galway. We picked up a total of 12 species new to Ireland. They were mostly Diptera. The most important habitats on the site were open grassland and scrub. And again, you know, that agrees with comments that Jesmond made about the value of those scrub margin habitats, where the scrub meets the grassland. They're pretty important features for these sites. And that's really what our survey was telling us. And wetland habitats, even at Slieve Carron, were quite an important feature. So Slieve Carron being quite a dry habitat, the very limited amounts of wet habitat that were there were still quite important. The other really interesting thing was that the woodland habitat was really quite impoverished. I don't fully understand why that was, because hazel scrub has been a feature of the Burren for hundreds and hundreds of years, possibly millennia, although it may be related to cycles of scrub clearance and then regrowth. So a lot of the sort of classic saprophytic species will be are quite sedentary and they don't tend to move very far. So it may be due to those cycles of woodland clearance that have effectively eradicated parts of the woodland fauna, but certainly much less interesting than the open habitats and the scrub. Next slide, please. So I won't, excuse me, bit of a frog in the throat at the moment, but I'll plough on and we'll see how it goes. I won't dwell on this too much because I think Dave has covered quite a lot of this already, but the pictures we've got in front of us really just tell us a story about how lots and lots of these species are effectively confined to this part of Ireland where we've got these extensive limestone pavements. The one exception I will just mention here is a moth called shuttle-shaped dart. So somebody who's moth trapped quite extensively in South Wales, that's a species that I would be pushing out of the way to get at the interesting things. And that kind of highlights one of the sort of more interesting aspects of Irish entomology, really, which is that species which may be common and widespread in Britain are sometimes quite rare or absent from Ireland for reasons that are not always immediately obvious. The shuttle-shaped dart is pretty unmistakable, I'd say, and that was recorded not as part of the work that we were doing, but by some visiting mothers from England. Shuttle-shaped dart is generally regarded as probably a migrant species, so probably with no established populations here. But normally you'd expect migrants to mostly turn up on the kind of south and east coasts. But there is a small possibility, I guess, that there is an isolated colony of that moth that finds suitable conditions in the Burren, but maybe aren't available elsewhere in Ireland. So something to keep an eye out for, perhaps, if anybody's moth trapping down there. Probably likely to be a migrant, I suspect, but certainly a minor possibility. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about some of the other interesting things that we found. I haven't got time to go through all of these, unfortunately, but somebody was talking about ant-associated species earlier, and we did find quite a reasonable assemblage of probably around 10 species that have got very clear ant associations whilst we were conducting this survey. One of those is in that central whole round blob in the middle there. That's a thing called Diporina tristis. It might have changed its name now, actually, but never mind. I can't keep pace with all that. So that's something that's sort of related to the Steatoda, the false widow species, and it hangs around at ground level and makes a little web and captures ants, which it then feeds on. Ants are not generally fed upon by many other invertebrates because of their fairly feisty and aggressive nature, but Diporina tristis is one of the ant-associated species that's made a bit of a living doing that. This species at the top here is Evansia mirans, and that has a very clear ant association, so that protects itself by living under stones in the middle of ant colonies. So whether it actually feeds on the ants, I'm not 100% sure, but it certainly is able to evade detection by the ants, and that's where it makes its home. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the Diptera, we sampled quite a lot of Diptera, including some of the Burren specialities. So this big fly up on the top right-hand side there is Sarcophaga discifera, which is more or less confined to the Burren. We've got Chalosia ahenia, which again is a Burren speciality up in the top middle. So that was pretty common actually, hanging around on the limestone pavement, just sort of sunning itself and warming up. The species which is in the half round down at the bottom left is Microdon mutabilis, which is another ant-associated species, which was living under stones. Very distinctive thing, kind of hunched up, and you'll see it flying around in lazy circles around the margins of the limestone pavement there. Next slide, please. I won't talk too much about the beetles because hopefully Roy's in the audience there somewhere, and if anybody's got any questions about those, you're probably far better off talking to Roy than me. But we did find Pterostychus pterimus, which is the big ground beetle in the top right-hand side, which is extinct in Britain now, and so that was in its classic habitat of cut over fen. The thing on the bottom right is Bagus lutosus, which is one of the species that clings on to horsetail stems in water. Very difficult to find, but it was there. Next slide, please. And just a quick roundup on the few other things that we found. A couple of interesting bees. We've got the moss carder bee and the shrill carder bee. My impression, however, is that these are actually few and far between in the Burren, and the dunes in the southeast of Ireland are probably a better place, they're more diverse and easier to find them, they're more numerous. We also found dark bush cricket, but that wasn't very numerous, just 2 specimens of that, and also a new colony of the Irish damselfly. Next slide, please. So just looking overall at what we found, again, I've probably not got a lot of time to talk about this now, but the standout groups in terms of numbers were Diptera, not really a great surprise, Coleoptera, again, not a great surprise, and spiders. The key point really to take away from this is that there was not actually that much overlap between what we found on the 2 sites. So in terms of the Coleoptera, there was only 36 species out of the 277 that we found overall that were on both sites. So I think that alludes to the difference between these 2 sites being quite stark, despite being part of the Burren. Next slide, please. So this is some of the Pantheon outputs, and Pantheon is a bit of software that's used primarily in England that assigns invertebrates to different categories. So just picking out some of the stuff there very quickly. So marshland stuff, we've got 88 species of marshlands in Ballyogan, and just 18 at Slieve Carron, 123 peatland species at Ballyogan, and 28 at Slieve Carron. I'm really surprised we actually got 28 at Slieve Carron, because there really was very little peatland there at all. Shaded woodland floor, bizarrely we got 67 at Ballyogan, where there was really very little shaded woodland floor, and 18 at Slieve Carron, where there was extensive dark hazel woodland. So something very odd going on there. I don't know what that was, but maybe these cycles of woodland clearance. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, final slide. Just to talk about some of the habitat management issues and future challenges. The continuation of the traditional grazing, absolutely vital for these sites. There's some evidence of fly tipping, which is a bit of a concern. Maybe not that much of an issue in itself, but people were fly tipping kind of garden cuttings. So there's always a possibility of ending up with some of the species that we really don't want in these habitats. Scrub encroachment was likely to be an ongoing issue. So I've talked about the fact that scrub margin is really important. What we don't want is these sites to end up entirely covered in hazel woodland, which is likely to happen in due course if that scrub isn't managed. I think the Burren itself is big enough and so stony in places that agricultural intensification may never become a massive issue, but seeing bright green blobs appearing in the middle of some of these rather beautiful habitats is a bit of a shame. And I'll leave it there if I can.
Thanks very much, Adam. That came across very, very clearly. And thanks very much for that. So any questions? I'm not sure whether anything's come in the chat, but anybody got any questions around Maria?
Handy for the microphone handover. Just a comment and to pose the query about the shaded woodland floor species being perhaps more common at the site with less woodland. Like you often get a pseudo woodland situation down the grikes between limestone pavement. So I wonder, is that a potential factor? So you often get small tree species. For example, with the snails, you often got kind of apparently woodland species down in those grikes because they're shaded, they're moist. So I wonder, is that at least part of the factor perhaps? But perhaps there's less limestone pavement at that site too.
Yeah, there is less limestone pavement at that site, but it is still a pretty well developed feature. I suspect that some of these shaded woodland floor species require a certain amount of humidity, which is very much lacking at Slieve Carron. Having said that, probably some of the Clinton grikes in the limestone are probably quite humid. But it was bizarre that the site with the really dense cover of woodland in places had a far less well developed shaded woodland floor component, but we just don't know what the answer is to that really. But yeah, and again, it is in other parts of Ireland, and again, Roy will probably agree with me when I say this, we do find woodland components in places where you really wouldn't expect them, simply because of the dampness and probably the altitude in some cases, and the overall climate. So things that are woodland specialists in Britain, which is what Pantheon's mainly looking at, may well appear to be more widespread in Ireland in some cases.
You should just explain that the Pantheon system that Adam is developed in Britain, so yes, may not have a total applicability down, but at least it gives a context to the surveys that Adam did and lets us interpret the results, which is a brilliant bit of work. So Adam, thanks very much for that. Enjoy the rest of your break in hot Somerset. We're in the hot Burren here, so there's not much difference.
Excellent, and thank you very much for inviting me.